Hey everyone, it's Ethel here. I know I'm back on camera, shocking, but it's that time of year again, the time where everything sort of seems to slow down and many of us reflect on the year behind whilst envisioning the year ahead. So that's why I'm here, to discuss some of the many challenges and achievements of 2020, as well as some of my hopes for 2021. But before I can continue, I just need to give a content warning for the following: mental health, gaslighting, transphobia, and COVID. So how about we deal with the rough stuff first? Though do know, if you'd like to skip this section on account of the year we're having, there are timestamps in the description, so feel free to spare yourself. However, it helps me to talk about the challenges I faced or are in fact still facing, starting with the healing that's been ongoing. 2019, much like 2020, was a shit year, particularly if you're a trans person who hung around the secular community. Big names suddenly decided that trans women were a threat to cis women in sport, and so they began calling for the removal of our human and civil rights. I was one of the people who took on the task of countering this narrative, and for 6 months I put out resources tackling both the science and the ethics on the topic. This put me in the crosshairs, and I got darvoed pretty bad. In spite of the fact that, in this particular instance, I'd spoken up about abuse I'd been receiving from a specific individual for the past 3 months to my own wall, having blocked them only for them to call on their 100,000 subscribers to circumvent that block, I was painted as the violent trans person. Nobody cared about the abuse I'd suffered through. They only cared when I dared raise my voice in response. Suffice to say, it was effective. Attempts to hold various transphobic abusers accountable for their actions were murdered overnight. The entire conversation buried, and trans voices effectively silenced. And in spite of the fact that rationally, objectively, and demonstrably my actions were justified, all this began to eat away at my confidence. On a general level, I felt as if I had failed everyone in underestimating the serial abuser involved, that my actions had cost the entire trans community any possibility of justice. Anytime I want to speak on a trans issue, there's now a big part of me that tells me I'm not equipped to deal with this, that I'll just mess up again, the trans community will get hurt, and it will be all my fault. But more than that, as an individual, the sheer volume of the gaslighting meant that, at points, I started to believe the constructed narrative. As a victim of domestic abuse who has studied both sociology and psychology, I've talked about how the fears of becoming an abuser in turn plague me. So for literally thousands of people to start harassing me, telling me that speaking in criticism of abject transphobia is the real abuse, that started to take its toll. I was having nightmares where things had happened the way people said they had, which forced me to constantly read and reread the police statement we'd compiled, just to keep me grounded in reality. Because that's the extent of the trauma this serial abuser inflicted on me. That's how strong gaslighting is. That if enough people tell you that you're a monster, you'll believe them, even if you have all the evidence in the world to prove otherwise. So a large part of this year has been trying to build back that confidence, both in the quality of my work and the nature of me as a person, which has been hard since the trauma runs deep. It also doesn't help that this has been the worst year for the channel, view-wise since 2013, and subscriber-wise since 2012. Which, considering I started the channel in September of 2011, does sting a bit. There's also been problems with monetization. As many of you are now aware, I've had to stop monetizing our videos on the channel because of my mental health. Why? Well, because of how YouTube's monetization system works, or more accurately, how it doesn't. There are 2 copies of my What is Violence thinking beyond the physical uploaded to YouTube. Both identical, save the later one having the outro slides from Patreon. And yet, only one is fully monetized, the other isn't. It's a sad fact of how YouTube operates. There's just no way to predict or tailor videos relating to the topics I cover in a manner that will keep them monetizable. The sheer frustration with getting a video up 2 to 3 days before publishing, only for it to be downgraded monetization-wise, was wreaking havoc on me. And for what? £20 to £30 a month? I was spending so much time fighting the system for a pittance, and it just wasn't worth it. So now Patreon is the channel's sole source of income, which has had problems of its own. Last year we lost $250 in monthly sponsorship in the wake of being Darvoed, dropping from $815 to $560 a month. This was just after we'd moved, as my travel insurance ran out, which included my health insurance. We had planned to renew it, but with the sudden drop, we had to shift around our finances just to stay afloat. That and my mental health problems meant I only got my insurance sorted out this December, a year into a global pandemic, whilst living in a foreign country. And whilst we made half of that $250 back, we only managed to keep this up for about 6 months before falling back to around $550. So there's been a lot of financial stress too. However, as bad as all this is, I know it's not entirely my fault. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. People's finances are taking a hit. The first thing to go in that instance is the disposable income, which is what we're paid in. On top of this, a lot of our content is deeply depressing at times, and that's something people are seeking out less as they focus on self-care. Speaking of which, there have also been several times where I've had to step away this year, which also has an impact on our position in the algorithm. YouTube hates punctuated posters, so unless you're selling a gimmick, it's a really hard place to be in. Lastly, the focus of the channel has shifted. Whilst we do respond to religious content on Essence of Thought, we're doing less videos touching on creationism and general apologetics, with most of the content we respond to touching on social issues, which is not everyone's cup of tea, so it's natural that there will be a bit of a drop-off in light of that. But in spite of knowing all of that, it's very hard to pick myself up and brush myself off right now. Yet I have to. Not just for myself, but for those of you out there who've been helped by our work on this channel. So why don't we talk about some of the stuff we've achieved this year? Starting with the very personal in how I've been exploring my gender. So for the past 2 years, I've been questioning my attachment to the masculine side of my public identity, so the name Peter and he/him pronouns. I was questioning whether I'd kept them around because I genuinely felt connection with them, or whether I'd kept them around for other reasons, specifically the comfort and convenience of cis people. You see, when I first came out, the secular community was still in the midst of the Gamergate era. I came out to some friends at uni in summer of 2014 and started dropping hints to my channel shortly thereafter. I described myself as psychologically androgynous up until that point because I had knowledge of that term from psychology, but I hadn't come into contact with many trans labels until I started university. Fact is, I was flipping terrified in coming out. It was bad enough being a feminist in the secular community, so to be a non-binary trans feminist was like, I was sure I was about to be run out of town, metaphorically. So, as with my feminism, which spent a whole lot of time explaining how I'm not like those feminists, I try to make myself as small a target as possible in regard to being trans. And the easiest way for me to do that was to effectively give others permission to misgender me. So cis people didn't feel put off by my presence, and that just isn't the way to live. Following 2019, I saw that no degree of respectability or accommodation will ever be enough to satiate transphobia. Why waste energy trying? So here I am, Ethel Hendrika Thurston, they, them, and she, her pronouns. Though this is not the only way my understanding of who I am has evolved this year. Another thing that happened to me was finally coming to terms with the fact that I am autistic. I've known that I'm neurodivergent for years, and I think it's something that people who spend any sort of time with me do notice, but I'd never actually looked into the specifics. That all changed, however, as I began working on a piece covering Autism Speaks and why it's a terrible organization that hurts the autistic community. To do that, I brought on Levi as an autistic advisor and began doing some basic research, only for me to start noticing a lot of similarities between what was described and my own experience. Now, I wasn't sure if it was just a coincidence, but given the tests I took and the people I've talked to, it would seem to explain a lot of my various quirks, including my synesthesia. And it's been a big help in piecing together parts of my past I hadn't yet reconciled, whilst also arming me with the language to talk about my experiences, which is why I consider it an achievement. There's a personal sense of power gained through being able to put in terms who I am. Another major thing that happened this year has been my growing relationship with Levi from the A Levi Called Bird YouTube channel. I first talked to Levi at the very end of 2019, December the 18th to be exact, after I pulled my version of a prank. You see, a source approached me about the fact that someone was working on an expose of Rachel Oates, covering the fact that she published the private emails of a worried trans viewer to have her fans publicly abuse said viewer and make sure that nobody in her audience ever felt safe enough to speak up critically. That person was Levi. However, they'd only just set up a Twitter account and had 0 followers. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be funny for a mid-sized channel like mine to just follow them out of the blue? And so I did. It wasn't long before he messaged me asking how I was his first follower. Anyway, we continued to talk as we entered the new year, and eventually we started to talk about our interests outside of work, becoming close friends in the process. At the same time, Levi would help me out on various videos, such as my one on Autism Speaks, and he just sort of became the de facto editor in all but name. Eventually he approached me about making it official, so we did. Levi became the editor at EssenceOfThought, working behind the scenes to improve the quality of our content, and hopefully that shows. Now, the last big thing I want to talk about here is the creation of the channel's new show, The Trans Agenda, the origin of which goes all the way back to the start of this year, back to when former comedy writer turned professional transphobe, Graham Linehan, threatened to sue me and others for accurately reporting on his actions. Yes, that was at the start of this year. Subsequently, we set up Roll to Save, an event in which I ran a couple of D&D games and interviewed a range of trans voices, all to raise money in case Linehan did try to silence us with a slap suit. Now, we raised just short of £2,000 British pounds. Linehan backed off, and that money now sits there, waiting, ready to protect any trans person in the UK who is threatened with a similar slap suit. However, one thing I gained from all of that was the desire to do shows, and for a couple of weeks, I did. I did a show on how anti-trans groups were invited to talk at the House of Commons, as well as on a certain dirtbag's transphobia. Sadly, all of that was put on hold when a death in the family forced me to take time for myself, and I just never returned to the idea. That is until October, where, after seeing the garbage being put out by an assimilationist bootlicker who spends almost all of her time justifying transphobia, I decided to set up a show to counter the assumption that we should just take abuse. And that's how we got the Trans Agenda, and it's been going really well. I was expecting maybe 10 to 20 people to turn up to each show, yet we've been stable at a solid 70 for the past 6 shows. And that's just the start. Who knows where it will lead to this year? And that's something I find exciting. Which leads us on to the last part of this video, what I hope this year will bring. Going back to something a little more personal. As discussed earlier, I've been doing a lot of processing in relation to my gender and what it is I want out of life. And a big part of that has been me coming to the conclusion that I'd like to start HRT. Now, everything is a little complicated, both with being in India and with the ongoing pandemic, but I've already started reaching out to some of mine and Adita's friends to hopefully find out more about the steps involved with starting HRT. I also need to factor in the cost to figure out whether the channel is financially stable enough for me to do so, but at least we've taken the first of many steps. One of the big concerns I have over here is passing. Thankfully, my physical appearance is androgynous enough that it's relatively easy for me to tip the scale in that way when I go out. Even without doing anything, I often get directed towards women's bathrooms and the women's queue when going through the metro security. What I don't have is the voice. So I actually started practicing back in August, only for me to get to the point where I felt really good about my progress, decided to record a video in that voice, and break down crying with just how terrible I sounded. But I kept at it, and I actually got to the point where I was using my feminine voice at home throughout the day without putting conscious effort into it. Only for me to catch the flu and completely reset all of that. So I've been trying to work my way back to that point ever since my throat recovered, in spite of protests from my lungs, and I hope to reach the point in the coming year where I feel comfortable enough to introduce that voice to my work here on the channel. Something else I like to do, and I know I say this all the time, is try to work on shorter videos. This is something I am awful at. I like to tie together everything in a response, which means I have to take whatever I'm responding to as a whole, rather than piece by piece. The result of which is a chain of super long videos. Videos that take an incredibly long time to produce. I may not have the visual aesthetics of other creators, but I do pride myself on doing some of the most in-depth research. So I look to creators who do a great job of segmenting things, people like the Messianic Manic. But it's difficult for my mind to make the switch. Don't get me wrong, there are times which call for an in-depth expose, but I need to get better at building my skills when it comes to doing shorter videos. Speaking of exposés, I'd like to get my private project done this year. For those who don't know, I've been working on a series of videos since November of 2019, but finding the time between everything else is difficult. I'd like to get that project done this year, as there is a part of me which worries about a general sense of events being discussed are too far back in the past, which is absurd considering the subject matter, but there are people who think that way. It'd be a great weight off my shoulders to finally be done with the project, and I think that'd help my future work as well. Now, the last thing I hope to do in the coming year is make things more interactive. I realize that compared to other creators, I've always maintained a distance from my viewers, which is strange when you consider how often I get accused of leading a cult. However, I do want to make things better for you lot in giving you more of an insight and a voice in what we do here on the channel. And one of the ways we're working towards doing that is by setting up a Discord server. I mentioned it at the end of my last stream, many people seem to like the idea, so that's what we're working towards. We're creating the Essence of Community server to keep things in line with the joke found in my Twitter handle. Things are still in the early stages of being set up, but hopefully we can start letting people in just after the new year. So what are your thoughts? What did you achieve in 2020? Did we miss anything you feel we should have mentioned? What do you hope to see from the channel this year? Be sure to leave a comment and tell us below, since we love reading what you have to say. Also know that you can always help us out via Patreon, and on that note, we'd just like to thank the following patrons for their wonderful support: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Soraya and Katie, Garrett Van Vorst, Steve Corbin, Sosh Daniels, and Justin Allen. And for myself, Adita and Levi, for the last time in 2020, take care now and have a happy new year.